Welcome back. This is Chicken Philosophy, Teilhard de Chardin, episode 15, in which I will continue reading The Divine Milieu by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, picking up right where we left off last time. If this is your first time, then feel free to click here. That's the playlist for the Teilhard de Chardin series on Chicken Philosophy. Maybe you want to start at the beginning. And, okay, here we go. So this is part B of part 1. This is 1B of some general remarks on Christian asceticism. B. And if you possess something, Christ says in the gospel, leave it and follow me. Up to a certain point, the believer who, understanding the Christian meaning of development, has worked to mold himself and the world for God, will hardly need to hear the second injunction before beginning to obey it. Anyone whose aim in conquering the earth has really been to subject a little more matter to spirit has surely begun to take leave of himself at the same time as taking possession of himself. This is also true of the man who rejects mere enjoyment, the line of least resistance, the easy possession of things and ideas, and sets out courageously on a path of work, inward renewal, and the ceaseless broadening and purification of his ideal. And it is true again of the man who has given his time, his health, or his life to something greater than himself, a family to be supported, a country to be saved, a truth to be discovered, a cause to be defended. All these men are continually passing from attachment to detachment as they faithfully mount the ladder of human endeavor. There are, however, two forms of renunciation which are reserved, and the Christian will not embark upon them except at the invitation or the express order of his Creator. We refer to the practice of the evangelical counsels and the use of diminishments, neither of which is justified by the pursuit of a clearly defined higher good. Where the first are concerned, no one will deny that the religious life, parentheses, which was also discovered and is still practiced outside of Christianity, end parentheses, can be a normal and, quote, natural, end quote, flowering of human activity in search of a higher life. Nevertheless, the practice of the virtues of poverty, chastity, and obedience does represent the beginnings of a flight beyond the normal spheres of earthly, procreative, and conquering humanity. And for this reason, they had to wait before becoming generally valid and licit for a duc in altum. Editor Edward, could you translate that Latin for us? Duc in altum is Latin for put out into the deep. It's a reference to what Jesus said to Peter when he first encountered him, so Simon technically, prompting him to go to the deep water and lower his net for a catch. Peter reluctantly agreed, and as a result his fishing nets tore because of the great number of fish he caught. Thank you, Editor Edward. It would be nice if the editors did that, but oh well. Anyway, to authenticate the aspirations maturing in the human soul, that authorization was given once and for all in the gospel by the Master of Things with a capital M. but it must also be heard individually by those who are to benefit from it. It is, quote, vocation, end quote. With the practice of the forces of diminishment, the initiative must even more clearly come entirely from God. Man can and should make use of penances of some kind to organize the hierarchy of and liberate the lower powers within him. He can and should sacrifice himself when a greater interest claims him, but he has not the right to diminish himself for the sake of diminishing himself. Voluntary mutilation, even when conceived as a method of inward liberation, is a crime against being, and Christianity has always explicitly condemned it. The Church's most firmly established teaching is that it is our duty as creatures to try and live more and more by the higher parts of ourselves, in conformity with the aspirations of the present life. That alone is our concern. The rest belongs to the wisdom of him who alone can bring forth another life from every form of death. There is no need to be wildly impatient. The master, with a capital M, of death, will come soon enough, and perhaps we can already hear his footsteps. There is no need to forestall his hour, nor to fear it, when he enters into us to destroy, as it seems, the virtues and the forces that we have distilled with so much loving care out of the sap of the world. It will be as a loving fire to consummate our completion in union. All right, that's the end of the section. Moving on to C. Thus, in the general rhythm of Christian life, development and renunciation, attachment and detachment are not mutually exclusive. That is the heading of section C. On the contrary, they harmonize. Like breathing in and out in the movement of our lungs, they are two phases of the soul's breath, or two components of the impulse by which the Christian life uses things as a springboard from which to mount beyond them. All right, well, there's a footnote, and I'm pretty sure this is Teilhard footnoting himself. So I will read it. From this, quote, dynamic, end quote, point of view, the opposition so often stressed between asceticism and mysticism disappears. There is nothing in man's concern for self-perfection to distract him from his absorption in God, provided the ascetic effort is simply the beginning of, quote, mystical annihilation. There is no longer any reason to distinguish between an, parentheses, ascetic, and parentheses, quote, anthropomorphism, end quote, and a, parentheses, mystical, end parentheses, quote, theocentrism, end quote, once the human center is seen and loved in conjunction with, parentheses, that is, in movement toward, end parentheses, the divine center. Of course, as God takes possession of man, the creature finally becomes passive, parentheses, because it finds itself newly created in the divine union, end parentheses. But that passivity presupposes a subject that reacts and an active phase. The fire of heaven must come down on something. Otherwise, there would be nothing consumed and nothing consummated. All right. That is the general solution. In the detail of particular cases, the sequence of these two phases and the combinations of these two components are subject to an infinite number of subtle variations. Their exact blending calls for a spiritual tact, which is the strength and virtue proper to the masters of the inner life. In some Christian detachment will always retain the form of disinterestedness. I think that's the first time I've ever ended the word disinterested with ness. Disinterestedness, the noun form of disinterested. I kind of like that. All right, there's my commentary for today. Anyway, and endeavor, which belongs to human work faithfully carried out. The transfiguration of life will be wholly inward. In others, a physical or moral moral caesura. It's like Caesar with an A at the end. Yes, caesura. Caesura. Editor Edward, could you give us a little bit of insight into this word?
Okay, a caesura is a metrical pause or break in a verse where one ends and another phrase begins. It may be expressed as a comma or a tick, which is like a check apparently, or two lines, either slashed or upright. In time value, this break may vary between the slightest perception of silence all the way up to a full pause.
Thank you. All right. I guess I must have missed that one on the SATs. All right. Give me a moment. Caesura will occur in the course of their lives, which will cause them to pass from the level of a very holy, normal life, with H-O-L-Y. He just sometimes says W-H-O-L-Y, so that's why I'm clarifying. To the level of elected renunciations and mystical states. But for all of them, in any event, the road ends at the same point, the final stripping in death, which accompanies the recasting and is a prelude to the final incorporation in Christo Jesu. I don't think we need that one translated. And for all of them again, which makes or mars, yes, makes or mars their life, it's like the planet, but with a lowercase m, is the degree of harmony with which the two factors of growing for Christ and diminishing in him are combined in the light of the natural and supernatural aptitudes involved. It would clearly be as absurd to prescribe unlimited development or renunciation as it would be to set no bounds to eating or fasting. In the spiritual life, as in all organic processes, everyone has their optimum, and it is just as harmful to go beyond it as not to attain it. Another footnote. One thus evades the basic problem of the use of creatures if one solves it by saying that in all cases the least possible should be taken from them. This minimum theory is no doubt the product of the mistaken notion that God grows in us by destruction or substitution rather than by transformation. See note, page 80. We're on page 69, dudes. So in 11 pages, we'll find out what that's from. And parentheses, or which comes to the same thing, that the spiritual potential of the material creation is now exhausted. The minimum, in italics, theory may be useful in reducing certain seeming risks. It does not teach us how to get the maximum spiritual yield from the objects which surround us, which is what the reign of God really means. The one absolute rule upon which we can depend is this: in this matter, would seem to be this, quote, to love the world in God, something which may always become greater. To love in the world in God, something which may always become greater, end quote. All the rest is a matter of Christian prudence and individual vocation. See pp. 75-77, pp being page for some reason. P-A-G-E, abbreviated pp. Somebody's not paying attention. See pp. 75-77 on the utilization of each of us, by each of us, of the spiritual forces in matter. All right. End of footnote. Back to the text. What has been said of individuals must be transposed and applied to the church as a whole. W-H-O-L-E, not the church as a whole. Anyway, it is probable that the church is led at different times in the sense, of course, of her existence. What? Different times in the course of her existence, the sense of course, where did that come from? To emphasize in her general life now a greater care to collaborate in the earthly task, now a more jealous concern to stress the ultimate transcendence of her preoccupations. What is quite certain is that her health and integrity at any given moment depend upon exactitude with her members, each in their proper place, with the exactitude with which her members, each in their proper place, fulfill their functions, which range from the duty of applying themselves to what are reputed to be the most profane of worldly occupations. They've got those? Really? I always assumed. Never mind. To vocations which call for the most austere penances or the most sublime contemplation. All those different roles are necessary. The church is like a great tree whose roots must be energetically anchored in the earth while its leaves are serenely exposed to the bright sunlight. In this way, she sums up a whole, with a W, gambit of beats in a single living and all-embracing act, each one of which corresponds to a particular degree or a possible form of spiritualization. In the midst of all that diversity, there is, however, something which dominates, something which confers its distinctively Christian character on the organism as a whole, parentheses, as well as upon each element in it, and parentheses. It is the impulse toward the heavens, the laborious and painful bursting out beyond matter. It is important to remember, parentheses, and we have not finished insisting on it, end parentheses, that the supernatural awaits and sustains the progress of our nature. But it must not be forgotten that it purifies and perfects that progress in the end, only in an apparent annihilation. The inseparable alliance between the two terms, personal progress and renunciation in God, but also the continual and then final ascendancy of the second over the first. It is these that sum up the final meaning of the mystery of the cross. 2. The meaning of the cross. The cross has always been a symbol of conflict and a principle of selection among men. The faith, with a capital F, tells us that it is by the willed attraction or repulsion exercised upon souls by the cross, with a capital C, that the sorting of the good seed from the bad, the separation of the chosen elements from the unutilizable ones, is accomplished at the heart of mankind. Wherever the cross appears, unrest and antagonisms are inevitable. But there is no reason why these conflicts should be needlessly exacerbated by preaching the doctrine of Christ crucified in a discordant or provocative manner. Far too often the cross is presented for our adoration, not so much as a sublime end to be attained by our transcending ourselves, but as a symbol of sadness, of limitation, and repression. Go on. This way of preaching the Passion is, in many cases, merely the result of the clumsy use of pious vocabulary, in which the most solemn words, parentheses, sacrifice, immolation, expiation, end parentheses, emptied of their meaning by routine, are used, quite unconsciously, in a light and frivolous way. They become formulas to be juggled with. But this manner of speech ends by conveying the impression that the kingdom of God can only be established in mourning, and by thwarting and going against the current of man's aspirations and energies. In spite of the verbal fidelity displayed by the use of this kind of language, a picture is presented that is utterly unchristian. What we said just now about the necessary combination of attachment and detachment allows of giving Christian asceticism a much richer and far more complete meaning. In its highest and most general sense, the doctrine of the cross is that to which all men adhere, who believe that the vast movement and agitation of human life opens on to a road which leads somewhere, and that the road climbs upward. Life has a term, therefore it imposes a particular direction, orientated, in fact, towards the highest possible spiritualization by means of the greatest possible effort. To admit that group of fundamental principles is already to range oneself among the disciples. What? I guess, okay, maybe, that's the French literally translated into English or something. Distant, perhaps, and implicit, but nevertheless real, of Christ crucified. Honestly, I feel like I must have mixed up some of the words, because that sentence didn't seem to be much of a sentence. I'll try it again. To admit that group of fundamental principles is already to range oneself among the disciples, distant, perhaps, and implicit, but nevertheless real, of Christ crucified. I'll keep reading. Once that first choice has been made, the first distinction has been drawn between the brave who will succeed and the pleasure seekers who will fail, between the elect and the condemned. This rather vague attitude is clarified and carried further by Christianity. Above all, by revealing an original fall, Christianity provides our intelligence with a reason for the disconcerting excess. Yeah, that's the word. Of sin and suffering at certain points. Next, in order to win our love and secure our faith, it unveils to our eyes and hearts the moving and unfathomable reality of the historical Christ, in whom the exemplary life of an individual man conceals this mysterious drama, the master of the world, leading like an element of the world, not only an elemental life, but, parentheses, in addition to this and because of it, end parentheses, leading the total life of the universe, which he has shouldered and assimilated by experiencing it himself. And finally, by the crucifixion and death of this adored being, Christianity signifies to our thirst for happiness that the term of creation is not to be sought in the temporal zones of our visible world, but that the effort required of our fidelity must be consummated beyond a total transformation of ourselves and of everything surrounding us. Thus, the perspectives of renunciation implied in the exercise of life itself are gradually expanded. Ultimately, we find ourselves thoroughly uprooted, as the gospel desires, from everything perceptible on earth. But the process of uprooting ourselves has happened little by little and according to a rhythm which has neither alarmed nor wounded the respect we owe to the admirable beauties of the human effort. It is perfectly true that the cross means going beyond the frontiers of the sensible world, and even, in a sense, breaking with it. The final stages of the ascent to which it calls us compel us to cross a threshold, a crucial point, where we lose touch with the zone of the realities of the senses. That final, quote, excess, end quote, glimpsed and accepted from the first steps, inevitably puts everything we do in a special light and gives it a particular significance. That is exactly where the folly of Christianity lies in the eyes of the, quote, wise, end quote, who are not prepared to stake the good which they now hold in their hands on a total, quote, beyond, end quote, but that agonizing flight from the experimental zones, which is what the cross means, is only, parentheses, as should be strongly emphasized, end parentheses, the sublime aspect of a law common to all life. Towards the peaks, shrouded in mist from our human eyes, whither the cross beckons us, we rise by a path which is the way of universal progress. The royal road of the cross is no more nor less than the road of human endeavor, supernaturally righted and prolonged. Once we have fully grasped the meaning of the cross, we are no longer in danger of finding life sad and ugly. We shall simply have become more attentive to its barely comprehensible solemnity. To sum up, Jesus on the cross is both the symbol and the reality of the immense labor of the centuries which has, little by little, raised up the created spirit and brought it back to the depths of the divine milieu. He said the thing, he said the title of the book. He represents, parentheses, and in a true sense he is, end parentheses, creation. As, upheld by God, it reascends the slopes of being, sometimes clinging to things for support, sometimes tearing itself from them in order to pass beyond them, and always compensating by physical suffering for the setbacks caused by its moral downfalls. The cross is therefore not inhuman but superhuman. We can now understand that from the very first, from the very origins of mankind as we know it, the cross was placed on the crest of the road which leads to the highest peaks of creation. But in the growing light of revelation, its arms, which at first were bare, show themselves to have put on Christ. Crux inuncta. Editor Edward, what the heck is crux inuncta?
The anointed cross. When I was Googling that, as a side note, the only time the phrase comes up is in this exact usage by Teilhard de Chardin in this paragraph.
Thank you. Okay. At first sight, the bleeding body may seem funereal to us. It is not from the night that it shines forth. Is it not from the night that it shines forth? But if we go nearer, we shall recognize the flaming seraph of Alvernus, whose passion and compassion are incendium mentis. Editor Edward, would you mind translating incendium mentis from Latin into English for us? The editor forgot.
All right, so this is kind of interesting. It's a specific reference to Saint Bonaventure's description of the vision experienced by Saint Francis of Assisi during his stigmatization. And it's been translated consuming his soul, also fervor of spirit or fervor of the soul.
Thank you. The Christian is not asked to swoon in the shadow, but to climb in the light of the cross. Thank you all for joining me for this half hour of reading Teilhard de Chardin. Yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful day, week, month, and year. And